Mud breathed like a living thing beneath their boots. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and iron, that faint metallic note of blood that never quite left the trenches. Somewhere beyond the fog, a shell sighed before it screamed, and then silence folded back over the land as if the world were holding its breath. A rat scurried along a collapsed wall, pausing to gnaw at a bootlace that once belonged to someone's brother. The men hardly looked up. Hunger and exhaustion had blurred the line between disgust and familiarity. They were young, though the mud aged them quickly. English, German, French, faces carved from the same fear. Some clutched rosaries, some letters stained with rain. They didn't see enemies anymore, not really. Just figures stooped in the same endless rain, haunted by the same distant home. The trench was a place where humanity sank, but somehow persisted, where a cigarette passed across a boundary of barbed wire could mean more than a flag ever did. In the dim light of dawn, steam rose from the ground like spirits rising from their sleep. A voice murmured a song in a language the others didn't understand, yet the melody was known to them all, the lullaby of survival. War had stripped away identity until only breathing remained. They had learned to recognize kindness in small gestures, a bandaged hand extended, a nod that said, "You'll live another day." And beneath the gray horizon, something ancient stirred, the faint realization that even here, among decay and terror, the heart could still choose mercy. It was a quiet thought, fragile as morning light, but it lingered and refused to die. It began with a sound that didn't belong to war, a low, strained groan from the other side of the wire. The medics hesitated, half buried in the trembling mud, eyes darting toward their officer, who said nothing. Beyond the mist, the voice came again, softer this time, a plea without language. No uniform mattered in that moment. It was only the sound of pain, naked and human. One of them, a young orderly whose hands still shook when loading bandages, lifted himself from the trench. He crawled beneath the ghostly hum of machine guns that had gone quiet for now, carrying a white cloth torn from his sleeve. He reached the wounded man, a German, blood seeping through his tunic like dark ink. Their eyes met, not as enemies, but as creatures caught between life and the mercy of strangers. The medic pressed his hand against the man's wound and whispered something neither understood, a comfort shaped from instinct, not words. Above them the clouds rolled without judgment. Somewhere a lark sang as if to mock the silence that followed. In that small corner of hell, one act of compassion glowed faintly, unnoticed by history, yet powerful enough to change it. The question lingered in the damp air long after the medic returned. Why would you save the enemy? Some of the soldiers looked away, pretending not to care, though the thought gnawed at them like hunger. They had been told mercy was weakness, that pity belonged to the naive. Yet they had seen his trembling hands, the quiet steadiness in his eyes as he lifted a dying man who had tried to kill them hours before. There was no applause, no sermon, only the heavy silence of men forced to face something larger than orders. That night the trench seemed different. The usual laughter that masked fear never came. Even the rats moved softly, as if aware that something sacred had passed through. A few whispered prayers, not for victory, but for understanding. The young medic sat alone, staring at his hands, unsure if he'd done something noble or foolish. The world outside still demanded vengeance, yet within him stirred an ancient truth. Compassion was older than war.
The question would not fade. It would follow them through gunfire and blood, through every hospital tent and dying breath, a haunting reminder that mercy, once awakened, does not sleep again. The field hospital was barely a shelter, more a scar carved into the earth, lined with canvas that trembled every time the artillery spoke. The air inside was a thick, fevered mixture of sweat, iodine, and the metallic sting of blood. Lanterns swung from hooks, casting nervous shadows that shivered over rows of bodies. A surgeon's sleeve was soaked halfway to the elbow. He didn't notice. He worked by rhythm now. Cut, clamp, tie, breathe, each motion a desperate hymn against the chaos outside. The wounded came in waves, carried on stretchers that dripped mud and humanity in equal measure.
A boy no older than 18 stared at the ceiling as if searching for sky. Another whispered for his mother until morphine silenced him. Somewhere behind the screens, a man prayed in French. Another cursed in German. The language didn't matter. The pain was fluent. Rats moved confidently beneath the cots, feeding on the bandages discarded too soon. Outside, the dull roar of shell fire pressed like thunder on the canvas roof, shaking loose dust and fragments of plaster that fell like tired snow. No one spoke of victory here. The doctors fought a quieter war, one without medals, only the ticking pulse of a dying man and the echo of their own exhaustion. Every heartbeat saved was defiance. Every death was a reminder that mercy, though small, was still possible. When the barrage grew louder, they simply leaned closer to their work, their faces ghostly in the yellow light, as if determined to carve order from the unending ruin. In this pit of flesh and mud, the human spirit still moved, fragile, stubborn, and unbearably alive. Between the screams and the pounding of distant guns, there were moments so gentle they almost felt unreal. A nurse, her hands trembling from hours without rest, wiped the forehead of a soldier who would not live till dawn. She hummed quietly, a song from home, or perhaps from nowhere at all, just something to remind the dying that the world once had music. The soldier's breathing slowed, and in that fragile pause, the ward seemed to hold its breath with him. Outside, the war raged without mercy. Inside, she gave what mercy she could. Another medic, older and slower, shared half a biscuit with a boy missing a leg. They didn't speak. Words were useless things here. The boy smiled faintly, the kind of smile that costs a lifetime to make, and for a heartbeat, the mud and blood faded into the background. In a corner, someone laughed, softly, tenderly, at a clumsy joke told by a man who had seen too much. It wasn't joy, it was survival, disguised as laughter. There were letters tucked under pillows, locks of hair, prayers whispered into gauze. Between one dying breath and the next, these small rituals of care formed a fragile bridge over the abyss. No one called it heroism. It was simpler than that, an instinct to keep the light alive in a place where everything else had gone dark. When dawn finally came, it felt like an intrusion. The gray light spilled through the torn canvas, revealing faces too tired to look away. A convoy waited beyond the ridge, ambulances painted white, marked with red crosses that gleamed faintly beneath the soot. The worst of the wounded were lifted gently, their moans fading into the distance as the engines coughed to life. For a moment, the trench hospital seemed to exhale. The sound of the wheels retreating through mud carried with it a strange promise. Somewhere beyond this ruin, there were rooms with clean sheets, walls that didn't tremble, and air that didn't taste of smoke. No one quite believed it, yet they wanted to. As the last stretcher disappeared into the mist, a young nurse whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe they'll find peace there." Her voice hung softly, half hope, half disbelief, as the guns resumed their song.
They worked in halls that smelled of carbolic and candle smoke, their footsteps muffled by the soft shuffle of linen and whispered orders. The war still echoed beyond the horizon, but inside these makeshift hospitals, another rhythm ruled, a quiet, stubborn devotion to life itself. The Allied medics moved like a single organism, hands steady, voices low, eyes calm even when the world outside trembled. Each had taken an oath that reached further than flags or borders, one that began with a simple truth: to heal is to serve something greater than victory. They washed the mud from wounds without asking which side the soldier had fought on. Pain did not wear a uniform here. It only had faces, young, pale, and human. Nurses bent close enough to feel the faint warmth of fading breaths, whispering names they would never remember, because remembering wasn't the point. The work was its own prayer. In this fragile stillness, medicine became a quiet rebellion against the madness beyond the walls. Each pulse steadied was an act of defiance. Each life saved, a vow kept beneath the noise of empire and ideology. Here, compassion was law, and even the dying were treated with dignity, as though mercy itself were the final victory left to win.
The doors burst open under the weight of stretcher-bearers, boots slick with mud, uniforms torn by shrapnel. On the stretcher lay a man in field gray, a German. His face was the color of ash, his breath thin as silk thread. The room froze. For a moment, even the lamps seemed to dim, as if the very air hesitated to decide what mercy meant. A nurse dropped her gloves. A young orderly muttered under his breath the words half prayer, half curse. The war had taught them to harden, to see the enemy not as a man, but as a wound inflicted upon the world. But the doctor, a calm figure with lines of exhaustion carved deep around his eyes, simply said, "Put him here." His voice carried no hesitation, no politics. The stretcher touched the clean white sheets, and the transformation began. The German's body, once a symbol of hatred, became something simpler: flesh, blood, pulse. As the surgeon leaned in, the light caught the red cross stitched on his sleeve. It gleamed faintly, a small, stubborn emblem of promise. Around them, the others returned to motion, scissors passing, gauze unfolding, silence deepening. No one spoke of sides again. In that charged stillness, they all felt it, the fragile truth that compassion, once chosen, makes enemies impossible to hate. When the operation was over, the room felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. The German soldier slept beneath clean linen, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of fragile survival. Around him, the ward carried on, nurses replacing bandages, medics whispering across languages, the steady heartbeat of care outpacing the sound of war outside. In those quiet moments, something profound revealed itself. Medicine did not recognize the lines men drew in soil or on maps. The body, when opened, spoke the same language in every man. A wounded heart bled the same, whether from Hamburg or London. A pulse once lost begged to return with equal desperation. The scalpel did not care for uniform colors, it only listened for life. And in that listening, the doctors became witnesses to something purer than allegiance, the shared fragility of existence. Somewhere, a nurse whispered, "He'll live." It wasn't triumph, but grace. In that single statement, the chaos of nations shrank to silence. War demanded division, healing refused it. And as the candlelight flickered across faces too tired to hate, they understood. To save even one enemy was to save a part of themselves. The lamps burned low, their glow trembling over metal trays and the pale arc of a surgeon's wrist. Outside, rain tapped against the canvas like an anxious heartbeat, each drop echoing the rhythm within the tent. The German soldier lay still, his chest rising shallowly beneath the sheet, skin glistening with fever. The air smelled of antiseptic and sweat, of fear and faith mingled together. The doctor's breath was slow, his eyes narrowed behind fogged spectacles. Around him, hands waited, nurses poised, scalpels gleaming like frozen lightning. Then came the first incision. The sound was small, almost tender, like silk tearing in a quiet room. Blood welled up, dark and steady. A nurse leaned closer, cloth ready, her pulse in her throat. The surgeon worked with an unhurried grace that defied the chaos beyond the tent flaps. Every movement was deliberate, reverent, as though he were repairing not a man, but the idea of mercy itself. A shell landed somewhere far away, its thud muffled by distance. No one flinched. The world had narrowed to the fragile territory between life and loss. Inside that silence, war dissolved. Only breath remained. And with each stitch, each heartbeat restored, they wove defiance into flesh. Her hands trembled, though not from fatigue alone. As she pressed the gauze against the wound, she could feel the faint pulse beneath her fingers, fragile, human, and terribly familiar. The soldier's face, pale and still, might have belonged to anyone. His hair was matted with dirt, his lashes trembling as if dreaming of a home she would never see. She tried not to think about the uniform folded at the edge of the cot, or the insignia that marked him as the enemy. In this moment, he was only a boy, printed neatly above the words, "Killed in action." For weeks she had felt nothing but hollow rage, a kind of quiet burning that never found air. Now, looking at this stranger breathing beneath her care, she felt that fire soften. What good was hate, she wondered, when life itself was already so fragile? What did victory mean if it required killing the instinct to be kind? The surgeon's voice broke her thoughts. "He'll live," he said. She nodded, tears she hadn't expected pooling quietly. In that instant she understood. Mercy wasn't surrender, it was strength, the kind that no army could command and no death could erase. When he opened his eyes, the room was wrapped in half-light, that fragile hour when night forgets to leave. The nurse was still there, seated beside him, her posture weary but composed. For a moment, confusion clouded his gaze. Then he saw her uniform, the faint red cross on her sleeve, and the realization flickered behind his eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat betrayed him. The words dissolved into the hum of his breath.
She said nothing. She only met his gaze, steady and unguarded. In that silence, an entire conversation passed, of pain endured, of mercy given, of understanding that asked for nothing in return. The war, the flags, the orders, all seemed impossibly distant now, washed away by something older than conflict. They were no longer nurse and enemy, just two beings who had glimpsed the same truth, that compassion needed no translation. A shaft of morning light slipped across his face. He blinked slowly, a single tear tracing the grime on his cheek. She reached out, adjusting the blanket with a gentleness that spoke louder than any truce. For that quiet instant, the world was whole again, just breath, warmth, and peace. In the years that followed, silence became its own language. The war had ended, but in the hearts of those who survived, certain words still waited to be spoken. Many of them took to writing, not for reply, not for record, but as a kind of quiet confession. Some wrote to mothers who would never read again, some to brothers buried under soil that no longer bore flags, and a few, trembling with guilt or grace, wrote to the enemy. The letters often began the same way. I don't know why I'm writing this. They wrote about faces they couldn't forget, the fleeting kindness that crossed enemy lines, the way a dying man's eyes had looked so terribly human. One British medic described the moment his hand had steadied the pulse of a German boy, how that heartbeat haunted him more than any battle. Another confessed that hatred, once unlearned, left an emptiness too large to fill.
None of these letters were sent. They were folded into drawers, tucked behind photographs, carried inside pockets until the paper softens like cloth. Yet in their unsent words lived something unbreakable, forgiveness not declared but quietly understood. Each page a small monument to the truth they could never admit aloud, that mercy, once felt, never truly leaves the heart. Years later, in scattered towns rebuilt from rubble, German veterans would speak of the strange kindness they had once encountered. Their memories came softly, like the echo of a song nearly forgotten. One recalled waking beneath white sheets, the scent of soap and morphine in the air, and a nurse's voice humming a tune he'd never heard before. Another remembered a British doctor holding his hand through fevered nights, whispering words he didn't understand but somehow knew were gentle. These recollections lived in the quiet margins of history, not victories or defeats, but mercies that refused to fade. Some wrote their gratitude into journals, others carried it wordlessly through decades of silence. For many, the war had broken everything except their faith in compassion. When they spoke of those who had saved them, their voices softened, stripped of bitterness or pride. The enemy had become a memory of light within darkness, and in that remembrance, the paradox of war resolved itself, that kindness, once offered, could cross borders the living never could. Time moved on, but the echo of that compassion lingered like a faint note carried by wind. Nations rebuilt, soldiers aged, and the noise of history grew louder. Yet beneath it all ran a quiet current, the memory of hands that healed instead of harmed. In every war that followed, someone remembered the lesson whispered in the trenches. Mercy needs no translation, and kindness owes no allegiance. It survives not because the world deserves it, but because someone, somewhere, still chooses it. And in that choice, humanity endures, fragile, imperfect, but beautifully awake. To heal without condition is to look at another human being and see not a cause or a side, but a life suspended between breath and silence. The doctors who lived through those years carried that truth like a scar inside them. They had been forced to look directly into the nature of suffering and to answer it not with judgment, but with care. In their hands, healing became an act of quiet rebellion, proof that even in the heart of destruction, the soul could still choose gentleness. Every suture, every touch was a refusal to surrender to hate. They learned that compassion is not weakness. It is the strongest defiance of all.
To save a man who might have shot you hours before is to declare that life itself matters more than ideology. In that sacred understanding, the healer stands beyond victory and defeat, guided only by the fragile rhythm of the living. The oath they carried, unwritten in the heart, older than medicine, was not just to mend the body, but to protect the meaning of being human. For every time they lifted a hand to heal without condition, they proved that even amid ruin, love was still possible.
Their story did not end in those dim hospital tents. The ethic they lived by, that stubborn mercy, outlasted the war that tried to bury it. It found its way into every quiet act of care that came after. The field medic kneeling in dust a century later, the nurse holding the hand of a stranger in an emergency ward, the volunteer offering warmth to someone forgotten by the world. The faces change, the tools evolve, but the vow remains, a whisper passed through generations. We do not choose who deserves healing, we simply heal. In every crisis since, echoes of that old compassion rise again. It lives in the soft tone of a doctor calming fear, in the steadiness of those who run toward pain rather than away. These are the descendants of that light, the unseen heirs of those who chose empathy over enmity. Through them, the spirit of the trenches is redeemed, not by violence, but by care. History teaches us many things about cruelty, but from those who healed even the enemy, we inherit its antidote, the quiet conviction that kindness is not bound by time, nor by sides, nor by reason.
Morning light drifts across the ward, soft as breath. Dust floats in golden trails above the cots, settling on still hands that once trembled with war. Somewhere, a kettle hums, steady, domestic, unafraid. A nurse pauses beside a sleeping soldier, her fingertips grazing his wrist to feel the quiet rhythm of survival. The air smells faintly of soap and morning linen. Outside, the world turns, rebuilt, forgiven, alive. For a moment, everything holds its peace. The light lingers on her hand, warm and steady, and the hum of life resumes, gentle, endless, and whole.